When we think of Vikings, the image that invades us is usually tinged with axes, battles, and sailing sails. However, behind every conquest lay a harsher, more everyday truth. The act of eating was as strategic as war itself. In a world where the climate was merciless and the land scarcely bountiful, the Vikings transformed food into art, resilience, and ritual. This journey through their diet is not just a list of ingredients. It's a journey through the ancient intelligence that turned every bite into a silent victory. Before starting this video, remember to subscribe and like. When we think about what nourished the Vikings, we're not just talking about meat, fish, and bread. We're talking about a culture that transformed the act of eating into an art of resistance. In this first chapter, we delve into the heart of their daily lives, the resources that the land and sea offered them, and how each became sustenance for body, soul, and warrior spirit. The Scandinavian regions were harsh, cold, and ungenerous. The land offered no luxuries, and each season dictated what could be eaten and how it should be preserved. The short summers were times of intense harvesting, preparing what winter would not spare. The Vikings became farmers, gatherers, herders, and fishermen because they couldn't afford to rely solely on war or trade. Every corner of the landscape was a promise of food, or a reminder of scarcity. They raised animals that offered more than just meat. Pigs were valued for their fat, useful for cooking and preserving, while sheep and goats provided milk and wool. Meat was roasted, boiled, smoked, or dried. At banquets, it was offered to the gods. But in everyday life, it was carefully rationed. Nothing was wasted. Fresh meat was rare. What was common was to use every last bone. Fish, on the other hand, was abundant and ubiquitous. The Vikings were formidable navigators. They knew when and where to fish, and how to make fish last for months. They fermented herring, dried cod, hunted seals, and harvested shellfish. In Iceland, where land offered fewer options, the sea was even more essential. Dairy products were a strategic treasure. Fresh milk was quickly transformed into cheese, butter, and surmjolk, a fermented yogurt-like drink that stood the test of time and cold. Easy to transport, nutritious, and vital for long journeys. In clay pots, in wooden containers, every drop counted. Vegetables were scarce, but they existed: kale, onions, carrots, leeks, turnips. The turnip was resilient, loyal, and reliable. Grains like barley, oats, and rye provided the energy source, in rustic breads baked on hot stones, in porridges mixed with milk or butter. Nothing fancy, just basic. Fruits were treasures of the forest. They collected blackberries, currants, raspberries, and blueberries. Small apples that could be preserved dried. They provided not only flavor, but also vitamins that could make the difference between life and illness. This was their cuisine. Simple, wise, warrior-like. Every preserved food, every technique applied, whether smoking, fermentation, or boiling in iron cauldrons, spoke of a people beyond chance. The pot never went out. Food was strength. It was strategy. It was bonding. To eat for a Viking was to survive the world, honor the gods, and move forward, bread firmly in hand and meat burning in the spirit. After understanding what the Vikings ate, the next step is to understand how they made those foods last long enough to withstand the ravages of winter and long journeys. Because in that era, without refrigerators or supermarkets, preserving food was an art intertwined with time, tradition, and necessity. The Vikings not only knew what to eat, they knew when and how to make it last. Winter wasn't simply a season, it was a constant threat. Snowfall could bury the land for months, and a mistake in preservation could mean famine. Therefore, every preservation technique was a direct response to the urgency of the environment. Salting, smoking, and fermentation weren't culinary fads, they were life choices. Fish, for example, was fermented in barrels, sun-dried, or smoked over controlled fires. On the Swedish coast, surströmming, that intensely fragrant herring, is an echo of that ancient way of prolonging the life of the sea. They also preserved meats by burying them in cold swamps, where the mud acted as a natural barrier against time. Hard cheeses, butter wrapped in leather or wooden containers, dried fruits stored in woven bags, and cereals protected from mold by careful ventilation techniques. Each food had its place, its method, its logic. Everything was designed to last. not to look good. Now, let's move on to another setting, the longship. Because a Viking wasn't just a farmer or a fisherman, he was also a traveler. Sailing for weeks on the open sea required more than courage. It required provisions that could withstand humidity, swaying, and time. On their longships, the Vikings carried dried fish and salted meat, flat, rock-hard bread, grains that were cooked upon reaching land, and even dried fruits that served as a quick source of energy. All designed to be useful, portable, and durable. But even in practical terms, there was room for symbolism. Mead, that fermented mixture of water and honey, wasn't just a drink, it was a link to the divine. It was consumed at banquets, yes, but also on the high seas, where the water could become contaminated and sicken the crew. To ferment was to protect, and also to celebrate. Light barley beer accompanied these voyages, sometimes flavored with local herbs that provided medicinal properties. To eat and drink, even far from home, was to affirm one's culture, faith, and lineage. And if on dry land, preserving meant surviving in the home, cooking meant living together. The Viking house, long and rustic, had one heart, the fire. There was no modern fireplace, but a central space where a constant flame burned. Above it hung iron or ceramic cauldrons in which soups, stews, porridge, dense mixtures of meat, fish, vegetables, and grains were cooked. It was nutritious food, yes, but also strategic, boiling concentrated calories and simplified preparation. Women were the masters of that fire. Although they didn't go to war, their wisdom in the kitchen could decide who survived the winter. They knew how to transform scarcity into sustenance. Meat was roasted by turning it on wooden spits over an open fire. Bread was baked in rudimentary stone ovens, and everything was served in clay or wooden containers, each with its own story. Even at banquets, cooking wasn't just about preparing. It was about organizing, prioritizing, and symbolizing. Meals reflected social roles, the balance between genders and generations. The elderly received special portions, children learned by helping others, and the gods also had their share. Food offerings weren't decorative, they were pacts. Eating meant acknowledging the other, the environment, the invisible. Food was a mirror of Viking society. Every aroma that rose from the pot, every loaf of bread broken at the table, every wooden spoon dipped into the stew, it was a form of resistance, communion, and identity. These weren't luxuries, they were rituals. And in each of them, the flame of the Norse people was kept alive. Of course, here's a shorter version of chapters 4 and 5, keeping the narrative and emotional style. Although Viking food might have seemed rustic, it was actually imbued with meaning. Eating was also a ritual. Every feast following an alliance or victory featured fine meat, mead poured from carved horns, and ancient music. Rather than celebrating, the gods were honored. Freyr, for example, received food offerings as a symbol of fertility and gratitude. Viking women mastered the kitchen as an act of domestic leadership. They knew how to transform scarcity into survival. Children learned early on to gather, care for animals, and understand that feeding was part of living. And the elderly were honored with special portions, as guardians of memory. But the most symbolic banquet was the funeral one. In honor of fallen warriors, abundant food, sacrifices, and personal belongings were offered and carried with the deceased to Valhalla, where, according to mythology, an eternal boar was cooked and revived each night. Eating well here also paved the way for the afterlife. In everyday life, schedules were sacred. A simple breakfast at dawn, flatbread, warm porridge, fermented whey, and a more substantial dinner at sunset. The privileged had extra bites, but the order was always respected. Archaeology confirms all this. Bones, seeds, vessels with traces of fat, everything speaks to a culture that turned eating into an act of faith and belonging. In the end, the Vikings didn't eat just out of necessity. They ate to remember who they were, to connect with their people and their gods, to resist the cold and forgetfulness. In every spoonful, a story. In every loaf, a victory. In every pot, the essence of a people who never let hunger extinguish their fire. Thus, beyond the epic tales and myths of Valhalla, Viking cooking reveals itself as a daily ceremony of survival and meaning. Every pot on the fire, every piece of bread, and every sip of mead spoke of a deep connection with the environment, with the gods, and with one's own community. Eating wasn't just nourishment, it was reaffirming that, even in the frozen vastness of the north, the soul could find warmth and flavor. Today, when we relive their hearths in our imaginations, we celebrate not only their strength, we celebrate their wisdom. As always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. See you in the next video.